Welcome to episode 3 of Unlocking California Politics. My name is Sanjay Wagle. I'm the Senior Vice President for Governmental Affairs with the California Association of Realtors. Today, I have with me Joel Singer, the CEO of the California Association of Realtors, who has held that top position for the past 30 years, overseeing C.A.R's dramatic growth in business development, membership, and the political sphere of our organization as well. I could go on with all the achievements, but that would take up most of the time of this podcast. So I will just leave it at that he has had an extraordinary influence on California real estate, and in particular, anticipating the importance of the internet and the electronic transaction. But he will be leaving at the end of this year. And today we are hoping to get his insights based on his many years with our association. Welcome, Joel.
Thank you, Sanjay. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, Joel, I'm going to go ahead and start off with a discussion of something which is on everybody's mind these days, which is housing. When you started working for the association many years ago, you started off as an economist, and California still captured the imagination of middle-class people across this country and around the world, in part as an affordable, amazing place to live. Now middle-class people are actually leaving California in large part because of housing prices. How did we end up in this situation where so much of California homeownership seems unachievable for middle-class people?
You know, Sanjay, this has been a troubling but consistent pattern in California. California was actually more affordable than the nation as a whole in the mid-1970s. But since then, California housing affordability relative to the nation as a whole has, transformed itself, where California is an environment where really only the wealthy can purchase homes. And as a result, our homeownership rate in California is a good 10 points below the national average, if not even more. And there's lots of reasons for it, but the reason that really doesn't explain it is that there isn't enough land. I hear this, oh, we're built out. That's not what it is. It's a policy set of dilemmas that have caused California housing to be so unaffordable. First and foremost is just the regulation and the cost of development. It's the permitting process, the length in which it takes us to go from raw land to a completed home. But in general, it's just the desire to really restrict housing more than anything else. And that has consistently increased prices relative to what they need to be. And as a result, in 2020 and 2019, we saw the first declines in California population in at least 120 years. It's quite shocking.
What do you think is behind resistance to building?
Well, there's lots of reasons. One is the obvious, I think, and a reasonable consideration. We haven't built enough infrastructure in some ways, and transportation is so difficult that people view it as creating more traffic first and foremost. But it's more than that. California has such a high cost structure that it's also an attempt to recoup the costs of the regulatory environment, and more so. There's fiscal constraints as well. And all of that has led to a situation where both public policy and public attitudes have been basically anti-housing, anti-growth of any kind, really.
Do you think this trajectory we're on, or seem to be on, is reversible?
I'd like to say yes. And the problem is I've thought that for most of my career, and I've been proven wrong. I do think their concerns at the moment about housing are so dramatic that I think there is a question now. And we've seen some substantial legislative action that should lead to more housing. But my concern remains that it's too little too late.
So do you see California meeting this challenge? It sounds like you're somewhat pessimistic.
Yeah, I'd like to be optimistic. I really would. And I'm optimistic about a lot of things in the state. But our housing needs are roughly 165,000 units a year. That's just based on virtually no population growth, but the displacement of housing as it ages. We haven't achieved that for so long that it's hard to be optimistic that it's going to loosen in any meaningful way. But it can, and there's certain positive steps that can occur. We've seen some of those, but I have to think that there's got to be more of a public commitment to housing. People really have to understand what housing means, and maybe it comes in a negative way. They understand what housing means in the context of lesser economic growth, their children moving to other states, and the negative impact of not constructing housing. That may be the way we learn the lesson that turns this around and creates an atmosphere where you can at least build to your minimum needs, let alone catch up with what you failed to build over the last couple of decades.
Thanks, Joel. I'm going to shift direction a bit to talk about the real estate industry. The real estate industry has had a traditional structure of individual brokerages with salespersons representing clients, periodically faces various other models that seem to come and actually usually go. This seems to feel a little different these days. And so I want to talk to you a bit about iBuyers, which are now a growing part of the landscape. I say this, of course, and now Zillow has pulled out of the iBuyer segment of the market. But what do you think about iBuyers in general as a force in the industry?
Well, I think the Zillow example is probably more about a failure to execute than complete failure of the concept of iBuying, because I do think iBuying will have some meaningful, not overwhelming, but meaningful role in the spectrum of alternative ways to transact real estate. It's very convenient. It does produce a return. The notion of paying more for a convenient, certain transaction, it's probably the certainty that is even more important than anything else, suggests to me that they're going to have, in those instances where people have a real reason to have that certainty, they have a home that they have in mind, they have other needs to move the property quickly, that there will be that kind of market. But I never saw it as a dominant market, and I think Zillow has proven that in a very competitive environment, when your focus is on market share rather than economic reality, you can get into trouble, and you can get in quite deep trouble quite quickly, as they did over the course of the last couple of 3 quarters. So I don't know that bespeaks really where the market's going, because I do think there's going to be lots of other alternatives, some which are somewhat similar to iBuying, that are going to have a role. The ability to get a less costly and a more realistic type of bridge loan, which some of the, we're seeing with several other companies that are entering the marketplace, the ability to buy with limited equity, all those types of things to me suggest that there are going to be different mechanisms of brokering homes that are going to have some market share, but by and large, we're still going to see traditional brokerage as far and away the most dominant.
Do you think these other models can provide the same degree of consumer protection as the traditional model?
Well, they don't at the moment, but in some instances, that lack of consumer protection actually may be lack of protecting the investors in some of these companies. I actually, my experience with iBuying, which is just experimental, so to speak, suggests that the competition among these incredibly well-capitalized firms, Zillow being one of them, and Open Door and several others, led to a competition that worked to consumers' advantage. They basically got overpaid in certain markets. And I experienced that just looking at what the impact was in some properties that I dealt with in Texas and Phoenix. The iBuying drove up the price more than it otherwise would. And I think the consequences, as we've seen, have probably been much more severe for shareholders than they have been for consumers. But in the long run, these areas do need to be regulated. They need to be regulated to at least the same extent as the current brokerage industry, because the possibilities of abuse are probably even greater in these areas as well. And I think there's other concerns too in the iBuying and other spheres that only get discovered as they exist for some period of time, and consumers can compare them to other methods of exchange.
Okay, thanks, Joel. C.A.R. and frankly, you have been very responsible for the rapid technological change that the real estate industry has seen in the past, I don't know, 15, 20 years, especially, again, electronic transactions, the internet. Are there any other disruptions or technological innovations beyond iBuying, which we've talked about, that you see on the horizon or that you would be watchful for in the industry?
There always are. Somewhere in some garage, some teenage girls are coming up with something that we've never even thought about that will have immediate impact and an important impact on this industry or other industries. But I do think a lot of what we're going to see in technology is going to be further refinement of things we're just starting to see now or that are in place but are not normal. And a lot has been accelerated by the pandemic, quite frankly. The transaction is still not a virtual transaction for most people, but the ability to do a virtual transaction is just about in grasp. And the most interesting part of that, from my perspective, is that the contract to close portion is what takes the longest time. Some of that is because people want it. They have to decide where they're going to go. They have to purchase another home. But a lot of it has to do with that mortgage origination aspect. And that aspect in particular, still defies the imagination in terms of technology. And there's a lot of room for improvement in that process, much more so, I think, than in most other parts of the transaction. And we're starting to see that. I think there's a lot of fintech evolution that's going to occur. The mortgage process is so painful that people don't want to go through it, even when it's in their best interest to go through it, often in terms of refinancing and so on. A lot of that, I think, gets solved over the next few years by the fact that so much data, for better and for worse, is available. And so I see that being automated in a meaningful way. But I also see on the realtor side, and taking care of that part and getting more predictability in the mortgage part is probably the best thing that can happen for realtors, quite frankly. That's where they have to invest all their time, reassuring their customer or going to alternatives because at the last moment, the mortgage, made unrealistic, the mortgagee made unrealistic demands about what materials need to be produced and so on. So I do think that's hugely important for our members and for licensees. But I also think there's a lot of productivity tools that will work to the advantage of our members over time. We've seen with virtual showings, we've seen the ability of the consumer just simply to have a much better in-depth understanding of not only the property they're looking at, but all the attributes that go into a buy-sell decision. All of that, I think, accelerates. And as a result, I think the industry becomes more productive in a way that, creates a better consumer experience.
Thanks, Joel. It's interesting you talked about the financial side. I recently refinanced, and I don't know what I consented to, of course, but in the course I was normally used to. So I said, "Do you need this verification proof?" And they're like, "No, we've got it all." Like, okay. Okay, so I don't need to submit anything. No, we've pulled up everything. I'm like, oh, good to know. But it was still a little disturbing too at the same time.
Yeah, and it's going to be that trade-off between the data availability and personal privacy that brings certain benefits with it, but also has enormous risk, right? And,
right. Yeah,
but by the same token,
eerie.
but by the same token, compared to the paper shuffle that it used to be, where you have to provide all your verifications of employment, of income, of savings, your rental receipts if you own an investment property, all of that coming in a manual way is unnecessary and shouldn't be the case. It still is way too often today.
Right. So moving on to politics, the main core of this podcast. California, in the time, again, you've been CEO, and obviously in the time you've lived here, has changed dramatically, both demographically and politically. In addition, there's been an effective shift to the state being a much more a state being dominated by the Democratic Party, We also live in a state and a nation which has become very polarized. The Realtor Party is a concept that we use to orient our political activity. How do you define this concept? How do you see this concept?
Well, the Realtor Party is incredibly important to practitioners and realtors because it allows for a commonality of interest to be the focal point. The Realtor Party really looks at everything from the perspective of our members' business, from their day-to-day lives, their transactional experiences. And it measures people on the support we get from those elected officers and those regulatory bodies in terms of making the transaction one that works to the advantage not only of realtors, but of consumers. And again, those who favor home ownership, those who support the necessary changes that allow technologies to come into place, those who are supportive of the values of the realtor organization, particularly, as I say, focused not just on the general business aspects, that's important as well, but support for homeownership, for housing, for real estate practice. And we can measure that vote by vote. We can measure it in terms of regulatory actions to a degree, in terms of legal actions. It's not a precise science, but it does allow us to take the politics out of it because, quite frankly, on different aspects of home ownership versus housing support versus support for consumer disclosures versus general business support, the realtors, because of their role in the community and the important activities just around housing, span both parties. And in this sense, the Realtor Party is incredibly important from my perspective.
And Joel, I think you captured one of the aspects of the realtor organization that is maybe not as true of a lot of business organizations, is that we do span both political divide in terms of our interests. The country as a whole, and even within the state, we've seen extreme polarization, and I would say to some extent we even see that in our membership to some extent. Do you think the Realtor Party concept can help deal with that? So two questions. One, to deal with that polarization, which potentially is manifesting within our membership, and just generally your thoughts about this polarization and how that impacts us.
That's a really good question, Sanjay. Let me start with just the polarization that we're finding in politics is extreme. And it's not something that's brand new, for sure. It's something I've observed over my entire career. I remember when, the individual legislators would fight like crazy. They'd have ideological differences that were every bit as significant as today's. And after the vote on the floor, they'd go across the street, quite frankly, and have dinner or have a drink with the other party and people who opposed them. And there was a collegiality that existed that doesn't exist today. Part of that is that politics in itself has become far more combative, and campaigns have become far more personal. And I think as that's occurred, that's kind of laid the foundation for the polarization that we see not only in California but generally. Can this improve? I think it can. But will it? Again, it's a little bit like the housing affordability issue. There's no question that it can and should improve, but there's not a lot of evidence there. And I think part of it is also just the interests of the parties in maintaining such distinct identities has also played into it to a large degree. And in California, where we are effectively a one-party state, it in some ways is even worse because the tactics that work in states where you really do have competitive politics, where you appeal towards the middle, are tactics that in California are not needed, not necessary in most instances. And as a result, competition has been more about the extremes rather than the middle of the voting block. And that is really, I think, from my perspective, the biggest difficulty. It's the disappearing middle in California politics that has not only been part of this polarization, but has made it so very difficult to get the right mix of politics, the right mix of decisions to address affordability or to address the state's entire situation as a competitive environment for business as a whole.
I'm gonna try to take comfort in the cautious optimism somewhere in there, Joel. The next topic I wanted to talk to you about is C.A.R.'s history. C.A.R. and its predecessor entity have been a significant political force in the state, but frankly, not always for good. It has played in its past to the worst impulses of racism and prejudice, such as is well known, sponsoring the successful referendum to overturn the Rumford Fair Housing Act and supporting racially restrictive covenants. We are a very different organization today, but there's no denying our history. How do you think we've done as a group grappling with our past?
Well, let me first, confirm what you just said. The history of organized real estate in California and frankly in the United States is one where some of the most base instincts regarding prejudice and race were articulated into policies. We saw that in California with the successful repeal of the Rumford Fair Housing Act. We saw it in terms of all sorts of local politics that organized real estate supported. And the results of that linger with us today in terms of home ownership rates and, quite frankly, economic positioning by race that is unacceptable. The gap in homeownership between Black and white California families is still almost 30%. That gap is virtually unchanged since the Fair Housing Act in the late 60s. It has consequences for the economy, and in particular has huge consequences when you look at the wealth assigned to people on the basis of race. That has to change, and I think the organization has come a long way. I remember that was one of the issues I had, quite frankly, when I decided to come to C.A.R. in the late 70s. I was aware of that history and quite concerned about it. I talked to a lot of people about it. Our lobbying at that time, our lobbyist, Doug Gillies, was one of the people who actually started making major inroads in terms of fair housing. And the National Association of Realtors at that point had already taken a much more positive position on these issues. What I think is the concern we all have to have is what I already mentioned. The gap is not narrowed. And to some degree, I think we have to take responsibility for that as well. Because our efforts to address that gap, to address fair housing, to try to correct the injustices that we in part created, have been consistent but not sustained at a high enough level. And although I think there's been huge accomplishments, I commend NAR on what they've been doing, particularly in the last several years. C.A.R. has really pushed, as you've talked about, Sanjay, and you've been involved in some very important legislation through the California legislature. There's more to be done, and it's going to require a continued heavy lift and a consistent effort and prioritization around the fair housing, around the housing availability, and around the income aspects of that, if we're ever going to get to the type of society I think most of us want.
It seems like a lot of the fair housing legislation that we've enacted helped to remove the barriers to housing, but haven't done much necessarily to remedy those past imbalances. So I guess would you say that's the next step, and frankly, the more difficult step that needs to be addressed?
Yeah, I think it is. And I think there's been a lot of discussion about it, but not enough even. The fact of the matter is, once you remove the barriers, you still have this equity and income gap that is so enormous that it's unlikely to correct itself, particularly in a society where we've seen income grow far less rapidly at the lower quartile or the lower 50% of the population as opposed to the highest 10% of this of society. So it's going to take very deliberate policy steps, in my opinion, to correct this situation, to get it to where it's even remotely in the realm of where you'd want it, which is, relatively speaking, access to homeownership should be available to people of all colors, relatively equally, and of all incomes, quite frankly. Having adequate housing, having shelter that is safe and hopefully affordable, that should be our goal. And the discussions that we're seeing in terms of reparations that are just starting. The commission's got another year and a half to go, as I recall, here in California. Those are going to have to be taken seriously. They're going to have to be areas where we look outside of the box. C.A.R. has been, I think, recognized universally, at least in the organized real estate circles, as thinking outside the box. This is an issue that we have to correct for all of our benefits. And that's going to take more radical thinking. That, as I said earlier, it's going to take a sustained effort. It's going to have to be one of the focal points of the organization. And it's going to require us to rethink some of our policies. Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves, quite frankly, in the same situation 50 years from now as we do today and as we did 50 years ago, with inequities that not only disadvantage people of color, but actually disadvantage all of us, because they impact the well-being of society and they impact the growth of the state. They impact almost everything we do on a daily basis. I don't think we think about that often enough.
Yeah, I think what you're saying also ties back to our original discussion about the supply, the lack of housing, because in a way that becomes a fair housing issue, because as we are trying to remedy these past inequities, frankly, just the lack of availability of housing becomes a problem.
That's right. And then you can if you create housing, you start to, impact the affordability in a positive way, and you can direct the way you create new housing to start to address different parts of the issue in more effective ways. And there's no question that if we don't address the housing supply issue, it's unlikely and far more difficult to address the equity issues around it. So I agree totally with you.
Right. So Joel, some big picture questions. How do you see our organization, the California Association of Realtors, evolving in the future?
Well, California Association of Realtors and California Realtors have been amazingly adaptive. I'm constantly stunned by how this industry adapts so quickly to such adverse conditions. And the pandemic was a great example. The industry obviously, was benefited by things that we were involved in terms of making sure that our members could engage in their activity. But the ability to adapt and the speed in which we adapted, and the members' ability to connect and get people housing when housing became even more important than it's been in recent memories, where housing was so central, that we saw this boomlet that we've seen over the last 18 months, amazes me. And I expect that's going to continue. But I think it's going to be a different environment, frankly. I think this industry is going to succeed in a different way as we look forward. I think it's going to be, quite frankly, probably a smaller group of people selling real estate. It already requires an expertise that makes it difficult for someone who's working part-time or only selling 1 or 2 properties a year to really do the best possible job of representing their clientele. But it's also been historically an industry of a second or third career. And in part, with employment not being that readily available, real estate was a fallback for people. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think increasingly real estate is going to be a first career, and a career that is taken because it provides such opportunity, not only to obviously make a living, but also to do something great, put someone into a home of their choice, create homeownership and all the benefits that it comes. So I do think it's going to be a little different. And we're starting to see it now in terms of even with this booming market, membership is not growing very much. And I think that's a sign of, quite frankly, an early sign as demographics dictate that the industry is going to be a bit smaller, but a lot more professional.
And Joel, you sort of touched on one aspect, which is the pandemic. Do you see it's hard to predict, of course, long-lasting changes as a result of the pandemic we've been going through for the last 2 years now?
Yeah, I do. And first and foremost, and I think this is something that we all recognize now, and I think recognized early on, the pandemic proved once again in the most vivid terms, the most meaningful way, how important your home is. When you're confined to it and you're working there and you're no longer free to go and do everything that you thought, it's just a great reminder of the value of home. And I don't know how else to articulate it, but I think that's going to be long lasting. And I think part of the value of home also is that people can better understand and differentiate the advantages of homeownership versus a property where they can't make those changes, where they can't adapt it to their lifestyle, be it the pandemic or be it changes in their family size. So I do think the most lasting impact of the pandemic is going to be on how valuable housing is. And I think that also is one of the reasons I can be a little bit more optimistic as I was about trying to address these issues. But I also think, the pandemic has as yet, unforeseen consequences, but I think they're somewhat predictable. I think for the most part, a lot of industries proved that they can work very, very effectively in a virtual or a remote way. And given California, we talked about traffic and its impact on slowing growth and the pain that is involved in the long commutes so many of us have to endure in California. I think you're going to see a different model come back. I don't think the norm is necessarily going to be 5 days a week, 40 hours in an office building. I don't think retail is going to go back to in-store shopping to the same level it was before. And the consequences of that, I think, are pretty dissimilar for retail and commercial office space than they might be for residential housing. My suspicion is that more of the overall construction GNP component is going to be housing based as opposed to commercial industrial retail. And I think those changes are also going to affect where we live. We're already seeing it, right, with second home communities, the ability to move out of state, the ability to move out of urban California. But it's also going to be how we live and what housing looks like. And I think that those changes are going to be pretty profound. It's going to take quite some time for them to settle out and the new normal to become really understood and appreciated. But I do think this is it's more than a 1 or 2 year disruption of the long-term trend. This is going to bend the trend lines in a different way.
Yeah, and I think we're already, in the Sacramento area where I live, we're already seeing some of that occur with a significant influx of Bay Area residents, many of whom might only need to go into work once a week, if even that. So we're already seeing that
well,
here.
And I think we're all seeing it in terms of employee expectations. Employees, in many instances, certainly in our instance, have proven that they can be equivalently, if not more productive, working remotely. And although there's lots of reasons that you want to bring people back into the office, at least periodically, for collaboration, for onboarding, for all sorts of things. I think employee expectations in a world where employees are going to have more weight than they've had for the last 30 years as demography changes, as there's a scarcity of employees relative to the oversupply of employees we've experienced for most of my adult life. I think that's going to propel these changes a little further than some people think. And it's also the bigger picture change, from a manufacturing world to a world where intellectual property is becoming ever more important. So I think it'll be a fascinating and interesting, and ultimately, I think we should be optimistic about this change. People will have more choice. People may even have a little more time. Think of how unique and fun that'll be. But I think this change is pretty profound, and it's beyond just the disruption caused by the pandemic itself.
So Joel, final question. With some people, after they leave a job or retire, quote unquote, you kind of have a feeling of what they're going to do. If we were to call you for a follow-up podcast a year from now, where are you going to be? What are you going to be doing? I don't believe for a moment you're just going to be having a margarita somewhere.
I hope I'm going to be in Bali or Tibet or somewhere, but that's a little uncertain. I'm not going to disengage. I have a lot of interests. Academia is one of them. I love technology, as you know, and I see some real opportunities in the real estate sector and others, quite frankly. But I am going to take a period of time to do nothing and be with my family and my grandkids. And after that, I'll think it over. But, the one thing for sure is it's going to be an incredibly interesting time and from my perspective, accelerating change. And that change can be bent to a very positive way. And I'm going to want to participate in that in some way. And I'm sure I will.
All right. Thank you, Joel. It's been a pleasure, and also been a pleasure working for you for the last, I think, 14 years. And again, a real pleasure talking to you today.
Thanks again for having me, Sanjay. I know the legislative aspect of C.A.R. is in great hands with you and the team you've built. And
thank you very much.
Thank everyone for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Disclaimer. The purpose of this podcast, brought to you by the California Association of Realtors, C.A.R., is to provide general and educational information and opinions from a wide range of perspectives regarding politics, voting, elections, legislative issues, and more. The opinions, beliefs, and views expressed by guests or participants of this podcast are solely their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions, beliefs, or views of C.A.R., its affiliates, their respective directors, officers, or employees. Reference to any individual or entity does not constitute an endorsement, recommendation, or any other position or opinion regarding that entity or individual by C.A.R. This podcast does not constitute professional advice or services of any kind. This podcast is available for private, non-commercial use only. You may not edit, modify, or redistribute this podcast.